Hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are in the world. I'm Katie Teitler-Santulo, and I am here with Boaz Barzel from Ox Security. We are here to talk to you a little bit about Oscar. Who is Oscar? What is Oscar? And then we're going to look at some software supply chain exposures. Before we get started, I want to remind you that this is being recorded. So we will have a recording available on demand for you to review after, share with your colleagues. And if you have any questions, if hopefully we'll have some time, we can share them in the chat and get to them. And if we don't have time to get to them today, we will be more than happy to answer you after the presentation. So once again, thank you for joining us wherever in the world you are. I'm Katie. I am here in the US in Massachusetts. We have Boaz, who is in Israel, my trusty colleague. Boaz, hi, how are
Thank
you?
you. Hey, Katie, it's good to be here with you, and it's great that we can do this together. And thank you for doing the presentation and everything around it. And I really hope that we'll have a great conversation around Oscar.
Well, we better, right? That's our
Yeah.
goal.
Yes.
All right, so let's jump in. Let's get to it. So we're going to go through a pretty quick agenda this for all of you listening and watching. We're going to talk about software supply chain security. What's missing? Presumably, you're all here because you have questions, concerns, interest in securing your software supply chain. So we're going to go over our view of why we need to pay more attention to it. And then we're going to look at some research and some data. We're going to talk about Oscar. If you don't know who or what Oscar is, leaving it a little mysterious here for the moment, we're going to go through that. And just to be clear, Oscar is an open and free resource for everybody in the community. So this is not a product that Ox sells. It is something that is there and available to help the collective community advance their software supply chain security, advance their application security. And so we're going to walk through that and show you how Oscar can be your best friend and help you be your software supply chain security savior in your organization. So let's get to it. Some numbers on the screen. We don't want to be fearmongers by any means, but our research team here at Ox has done an extensive analysis of the market, and they looked at over 100 million alerts over the course of a 9-month period. We're going to get into some more data later, but two of the most alarming things that they found is that 95% of organizations that were included in the data set had one high, critical, or apocalyptic risk within their software supply chain. The average organization didn't just have one, they had 9 of these high, critical, or apocalyptic risks. So that's a little bit of a problem because when we have so many exposures, we've got to figure out what to do, how to prioritize, how to remediate, because you don't want, it's like having 9 unlocked doors at the Federal Reserve, like you're just waiting for somebody to come in and take advantage of that. And then on top of that, so we've got a lot of problems, issues, vulnerabilities in our software supply chain, but you can see the statistic on the right, 1 in 5 applications. So 20% of applications have one of these risks, one of these vulnerabilities during runtime. Now, why is that problematic? Well, runtime behavior is a little less reliable in terms of what's going to happen. And there's a huge long tail effect if software is running in the wild and then there's a vulnerability that gets exploited. So I think I might have just answered the question, but Boaz, what does this mean? Why should people care about the software supply chain?
That's a great question. And I think what you've presented and what's listed also in the Oscar report is really one of the key aspects of, why should I care? Because eventually we're all developing. Every company today develops software. It doesn't matter if you're a shoe manufacturer or you're building cars or so any company is developing software. And as we're developing more and more software, we can see that the increased reliance on software and the digital transformation makes it harder to understand what we have with building in the software and then what we have exposed also outside as and we're adding more and more parts, especially third party parts like open source that's coming into code, which can be an daunting task because it's very easy to say I want to develop a feature and write code, but it's actually easier to just pull in a package and then another package and a third package, or copy the code from different sources and just have that running. And I don't understand what's in the code, how my developers, my software is exposing myself. And what happens is that I'm building more and more and more softwares and more application, and I'm expanding my business and I'm expanding what I can do with my business. And I want to get in more customers and more trust. But eventually, what I can see is that, as you mentioned, there's a lot of holes, a lot of unknowns within it. And these unknowns create an actual risk with financial loss, brand damage, regulations, reputation damage, disruption in the operation. And just imagine that, you're playing a game or, the gamers within us. I love playing games. When you play a game and now the server goes to maintenance and goes to maintenance again, or there's too many issues with it, or my credentials were stolen, or God forbid, my credit card and other types of information were stolen, I'm not gonna play the game. I'm not gonna pay money for that company. That company is gonna lose a lot of trust. And I think this is where we can see that the software supply chain attack landscape is increasing, more and more attacks, sophisticated attacks. We want to maintain that brand, that trust within organizations. We want to grow. And I think this is really why we should care about open, software supply chain in that sense, and why we should invest in it. I would, if we're going into that direction, Katie, I would like to talk a little bit more about, what's missing, because, we've talked about it, but really what's missing, what we've learned from the recent years about, software supply chain security.
Yeah, so it's a complicated problem, and the reasons, I mean, you illustrated really, really well what some of those reasons are. Everything from brand damage and disruption of operations. There's just such a long tail effect, right? A
Mhm.
long tail effect when it comes to software. Because as you said, more companies are developing custom software, but for efficiency's sake, for innovation's sake, they're using more and more open source code. Now, I don't know if you've heard this, but I have heard and read that in a lot of applications, up to 90% of that code base is from open source.
Yes, I can
Like that,
also tell that, yeah, I have a few developer friends. They prefer to copy paste.
well, yeah, because if you have that, quite literally, the name says it all, code base, why reinvent the wheel? It would take
Yeah.
so much time to start from zero. And in a lot of cases, that code base is great. But what happens is you have these transitive vulnerabilities, these transitive risks. And the same thing can happen with cloud. And when developers are moving at the speed of lightning, when they're attempting to get software into their business for internal use, for external use, for partners, for whomever, they are relying on this open source code and the elements that don't necessarily get patched. And that means that we're getting more and more vulnerabilities from stage one, from the design all the way through deployment and distribution of the software. And companies don't have visibility. The security team is trying to catch up on everything. Developers are moving at the speed of lightning. The tooling that we have isn't covering the whole supply chain equally. And as things get more complicated with development, as things get more complicated with security tooling, and we have these siloed tools, it's not always surfacing vulnerabilities early enough in the
Yeah.
development cycle. And so when developers are looking at fixing things, their goal is to reduce the number of alerts and fix the highest priority vulnerabilities. That seems simple, but unfortunately it's not. They don't have the visibility, they don't have the correct tooling, and they don't have the time. And so one of the things that's getting more difficult, more challenging, is not just the fact that software itself is getting more intertwined with various components. That's a huge part of it. But it's also that attackers understand all of these problems, right? And they've got this mindset, these behaviors, these tactics, techniques, and procedures. And developers are thinking about, oh, shoot, how do I fix this vulnerability? But they don't have the right tools to figure it out quickly enough, and attackers are getting ahead. And so I think that's one of the major problems that we have.
I agree, and I'd like also to understand your views on kind of software supply chain vulnerabilities. And as you explained, as AppSec team really grew out of different silos, lacking visibility and really lacking the understanding of how developers operate sometimes, and they're so preoccupied with their own security incidents that sometimes they're missing kind of the bigger picture. So what's the best way to understand software supply chain vulnerabilities?
So we're going to go back to a little stat here, um, and go back to the report that is, again, available on the Ox website. What's the best way to understand them? Well, you have to look at the attack kill chain, and you have to look at the different stages. But you also have to look at all of the various things that go into software development. Now at Ox Security, we call this PBOM, or Pipeline Bill of Materials. Probably a lot of you listening are familiar with software bill of materials. Software bill of materials, let's be clear, great tool to understand what's in a piece of software. Everything from the development and build environment to the deployment and distribution of software applications. So it's not just the code, it's the environment, it's the access, it's the sharing, it's, oh, your developer posted this problem on GitHub and then GitHub keys were leaked. It's everything that goes into building and deploying software. That's why we call it pipeline bill of materials versus software bill of materials. Our pipeline bill of materials, of course, includes software bill of materials, API bill of materials, SaaS bill of materials. So it's
Yeah.
more robust. And we think that even though that creates more words for people, more acronyms for people, it's important to think in this holistic way, because we have this reliance on open source libraries. We have this reliance on clouds and containers, and the complexity and all of the stages and all of the elements that go into the software supply chain make it a lucrative target for cyber attackers. So if we're looking at these stats, and we're going to get into this a little bit more, I'll leave that to you, Boaz. But if we're looking at this set of data that came from the research project over 9 months, you can see that we've got vulnerabilities all across the stages of the kill chain. And the reason we have to understand that is so developers can prioritize, so AppSec teams understand where they need to step in. And Oscar is a great way to understand the software supply chain, because it maps these different stages of the supply chain to attacker TTPs. It maps it to the stages, again, starting at their reconnaissance all the way through exfil, and then looking at business impacts. We'll have the screenshot of that there, but can you go into a little bit of this data and what it means? Because we've had this screen up for a second,
Yes.
and it says vulnerabilities across the kill chain. It looks a little scary, but let's take it down. Let's simplify it a little bit.
Yes. So maybe we should. I'll start, with a little bit more explaining about Oscar, and talking about Oscar. So Oscar really is the open source open source software supply chain attack reference. And what we've seen, and those of us that are familiar with MITRE attack matrix, we can see that we've been using, from the early days, from the Lockheed Martin, the Cyber Kill chain, and then the MITRE attack matrix. We're trying to understand how the attacker operates. And then what we've seen that the MITRE attack really covers the networks, the cloud, the endpoints, mobiles, and they're expanding that. But when we started to research the software supply chain, we understood that a framework that is inspired by MITRE will really help us understand how attackers operate in the software supply chain, and how we can not just understand how to defend ourselves better, but also really be familiar with specific areas, specific points, create a common language. For example, when we're referring to command injection attack, and I'm talking to a different security team or someone that's operating on my cloud security, I can easily connect the code vulnerability or the actual risk into an actionable insight that my cloud security team can take in order to mitigate this until we get the code issue resolved. And it also gives us a really great point of reference in understanding how much of the software supply chain security we have covered, which areas are more vulnerable, for example, and then build a strategy on how I can respond to it through different mitigation techniques, or, as you said, Katie, which is extremely important, being able to prioritize, not just based on, okay, see a vulnerability, CVSS is critical, I need to fix it. It's relatively saying it's not really true. But again, from this perspective, it gives me the ability to look at how attackers will operate, how it will be understood through my environment, and then being able to also understand, okay, so I have many vulnerabilities, many issues within the initial access or within the execution areas. And these are the areas that I would like to focus on as an example. So really, Oscar is a great way for me to build that common language, create collaboration, provide evidence through the attacker's point of view and a point of reference to build a better strategy and a stronger, I would say, an AppSec program, and really take it to the next level and mature it. And I think this is really something that I'm really happy to say that we've included that also with Ox. And what we're doing, we're able to map all of your security issues, as you explained, across the entire pipeline into those tactics and techniques, and immediately expose areas that attackers will target you. Attackers will use those techniques in order to target your organization, and it gives you the ability to be faster and get attackers, be faster and get ahead of attackers before they're actually, taking advantage of this.
Yeah, it's it's pretty robust. I mean, looking at this, and we've all seen the MITRE attack. I would bet everybody on this webinar has at least seen the MITRE attack, and this is also pretty extensive. So can you go back and explain who created this and their
Yes.
background and why they started with this?
That's great because Oscar was actually created from different leaders from Checkpoint and GitLab, Microsoft, FICO, and really a lot of people from the industry, including Ox, our research and founders. What they noticed as they are trying to understand software supply chain, there is a lot of gaps in understanding how attackers operate. And if we want to develop better security solution, we have to understand how attackers operate. So they come together, all these people from the industry, and we can see a lot more contribution that is done to Oscar. And this is something that we're seeing people understand the need as we have MITRE ATT&CK deployed in many security solutions, and a way for organization to create a strategic program around how do I mature my security. The same thing for Oscar. And really, Oscar is a fantastic way to, first of all, understand software supply chain security in its basics. And then being able to say, okay, with software supply chain security, I can understand the different tactics and techniques attackers operate. And now, as I'm building my AppSec program, I can and try to understand where are the areas. For example, if I analyze, and Oscar was built after analyzing a few hundreds of attacks. I think it's more than 300 different types of attacks that were analyzed. And then Oscar was built through that analysis. What we've seen that companies that are using Oscar today, they're using it to further understand software supply chain security, and then understand how they're using it for their own kind of purposes. And maybe this is I would say a great segue to my next question for you
Well,
is,
before we move on, I do want to point out that a little self-serving maybe, but Oscar is the first and only current framework of its kind. We've got
yeah,
tons of frameworks
how I forgot
in
that.
security. Tons of frameworks in security, right? Like we are not lacking for security guidance at all. But most of it is focused on more generalized security. This
Mhm.
is the only one focused on the software supply chain. It's the only one that was built by both builders and users of software in a collaborative way around software and applications. We've got great groups, and OWASP help contribute to this. So that's really important because I think everybody in the industry who cares about applications knows exactly who OWASP is, right? They know what OWASP does in their mission. So this is building on that. And again, free, open resource. And I mentioned, I'm going to go back a little bit here to a little bit of data. I mentioned the study that we did. And now, after those of you watching and listening, you've seen the matrix, you can see vulnerabilities across the kill chain and understand it a little bit better. Like, what does this mean? 36% of application with vulnerabilities in initial access. What does that mean? Well, it means that of the data set, over 100 million alerts, and tens of thousands of code repositories and organizations, 36% of the applications that were examined have vulnerabilities in the initial access stage, meaning Boaz mentioned something about poor authentication, stolen credentials, privilege access that is available, or authentication access that has been leaked, stolen credentials, reused credentials. We know that access is a problem generally in cybersecurity, but when it comes to software security, initial access means that an attacker has the whole pipeline. And as you go through the stages, execution, things like dropping back doors in code so they can come and drop malicious code, maintaining persistence by creating persistent tokens to authentication tokens, obviously elevating privileges, evading defenses. We've got a lot of issues that come in here, and you can see the distribution of vulnerabilities across the kill chain. It's not centered on one phase. We have initial access at about 36%, execution and persistence at about 32%, and then we jump over lateral movement and collection. Why is this important? Because once we know where attackers are, once they know where the vulnerabilities are, they can hone in on the weak spots. It's like if you're in a sport, let's say you're a tennis player, and
Mhm.
you know your opponent has a really weak backhand, you're going to try to hit the ball to the backhand as much as you can,
Yeah.
right? So that's really important to understand. So I just wanted to back up there a little bit. So moving on.
So, Katie, maybe we should go and really talk about kind of the mapping that we've seen in the report, and try to understand, what can we draw from the report? What like we're seeing on the screen, we see a lot of aspects around, initial access and execution, collection, lateral movement. So, of course, this is, where we're seeing most of our vulnerabilities, but when I see this, I immediately think that, okay, so we should probably invest in one of those five. And when I'm thinking about my defenses, I would probably want to start with like initial access and execution first, because if I can prevent them from ever getting into the environment, that would be the best. So, what's your take on the results?
Um, yeah, obviously, if we can quote shift left and prevent attackers from getting in, that's the best thing. So we saw in the other screen that initial access was the place where most vulnerabilities were exhibited, followed very closely by execution and persistence. You can see here lateral movement and collection. Problematic because the distribution of these vulnerabilities across the kill chain means that we don't just have one focus, like you said. Do you want to invest in tools that focus on these areas? Yeah, of course you do. But if you try to relate where are the vulnerabilities to where are the high severity vulnerabilities, you can see that the shape of the graph is fairly similar, not exact, but fairly similar.
Hmm.
So we can assume from this that we still have these five or maybe six areas, if we're including the high severity issues in this, where there's a little more risk. But it doesn't necessarily mean that we should only invest in these areas. We should only put processes in place for these areas. Because if you look at OSC&R and the report with all of the data in it, you can see that cross-technique vulnerabilities are very highly prevalent. And what the researchers found was that the more stages an attacker could combine, the greater the damage overall. And so you're amplifying the effects when an attacker can hit an organization's pipeline software, again, starting at the build stage all the way through deployment and distribution, you've got amplified effects. So that's super problematic. You've got these age-old security issues in here. We're looking at 31% of apps that were evaluated have backdoors in code. This is a 25-year-old issue. We've known
Exactly.
about these forever. It's not easy to fix, right?
So,
These aren't easy. So
yeah.
what does it all mean? Whoops, sorry. What does it all mean? I didn't mean to go ahead too quickly. So what does OSC&R mean for ADR or application detection and response? It helps companies understand the mind, the motivations, the tactic techniques of attackers. And it helps organizations unify vulnerability insights. It helps them understand where the biggest problems are and where organizations can have the biggest risks. Now, it's really important to point out we are a software vendor, but I'm going to say this in a public forum and hope our boss doesn't get mad, Boaz. But if you contact a company, a vendor company that says, oh, we can do everything, it's a silver bullet, set it and forget it, run away from that vendor. Run as fast as you can from that vendor. You need a vendor that understands the attack lifecycle. You need a vendor that understands software development and will give you flexibility in your tool set to be able to execute the processes that will shed
Yeah,
light on your areas of exposure.
I completely agree. I think that even take it at and also look at not just the flexibility that the vendor would provide to you. It's also about the evidence. So constantly sharing. So you're monitoring. You want to not just set it and forget it, as you said, but tell me what you're seeing. Tell me why it's critical. Show me the attacker's tactics and techniques. Show me the evidence and how it's in my code and how it behaves and if it's deployed or not deployed. I want the vendor to give all the information, all the evidence. So eventually, even if I automate the decision making or the ticket making, I want to understand that I'm building a trust between the teams. My results are accurate. I can just go on and deploy and say, okay, now everything's working and everything is nice and all good in the world. But definitely from this perspective, I think, and connecting back to Oscar, show me how attackers are going to attack me. Because for my organization, it's one thing. For your organization, it's a different thing. So show me, tell me what are the tactics and techniques attackers are going to use to attack my applications. And I think this is really an important part, and I'm glad that you brought it up, Katie.
What are some of the things you see or think when you're working with customers, Boaz, because you're on the phone and on video calls with customers and prospects all the time. What are the things that make a good ADR or ASPM tool? Because, in particular, I'm thinking about that prioritization issue that you mentioned. I'm thinking about alert triage. We know that on average, again from the Oscar report, the companies are managing 129 applications and almost 120,000 alerts. That seems
Yes.
pretty unmanageable to me. I don't know about you. You work a lot, but um, what what does a good ADR or ASPM tool do to help with that?
It's a great question, and really, I'll give examples from customers and prospects that I've been working with, and I think that in the beginning, the focus was really on scanning and getting results because I don't know what's in there. It's like I would say in the beginning it was like a black box, and I'm putting something, and it now pops in a lot of alerts and a lot of you know nice data, but companies realize that I have no idea what to do with all these alerts. I just see a lot of red dots flying around, and I don't know what to do with them. So I think that from a visibility perspective, first of all, show me everything together, and if we can relate to or parallelate to the IT, then I'm trying to build a SIEM, and this is where most ASPM started in trying to build a SIEM. I think that this is a nice first step, but this is definitely not the final step. And even seeing, as you mentioned, 120,000 vulnerabilities, 200, 300. I've seen organizations with more. That's not helpful. And if I want to operationalize and I want to get, I want to get the ground running. I want to developers start fixing problems. So I need to decide which problems. And I think this is really where the next step and ADR that comes into it. So even before ADR, understanding the context of the environment, understanding, what is really critical for me. But then using Oscar, for example, you can start implementing an additional layer of understanding and taking that. And this is what we see customers are doing. They're not just looking at what we say that it's critical in our prioritization. They're actually looking at what attackers will be doing. Where do I focus? And as you showed, initial access execution areas, I'll focus on those. And it considerably reduces the noise, considerably showing me, okay, these are the 5, 6 items that I need to fix right now. And I feel that, from a personal side, if I have a few items, because you have 20, 30 in your backlog, I have the same. If I had six, I would be happy. I would like, flying and very happy with it. So I think this
Today's
is
a good day. I only have
yes.
six issues. Yeah.
And yeah, and this is really where, you know, I see a lot of the security team kind of understanding that, okay, these are the areas. Now I can work better with developers. Now I can do my job eventually, and I can have an impact on the security of my organization. I can show that impact, and I can show that we've reduced the risk and we can increase our customers' trust, um, in that sense. And this is really what I'm seeing, and I'm thinking also kind of in the sense of what we can do and how we can take Oscar. What is the innovation that customers can do with Oscar, I would say, as part of their security strategy. Um, it's a really interesting one. But this is something that, from a build perspective, from a design perspective, I would think that I would like to include a framework that would help me to understand the attacker's perspective of what I'm building, if that makes sense. And then to plan my defenses, plan my operation accordingly, instead of at the end of the process, the developers coming to me and say, okay, we're going to release something. And I'll be surprised and say, okay, what are you going to release? Who did the security for that? It's okay, it's fine. Take it anyway, and eventually they'll release it. They're not going to wait for you because they have their own pressures. But if you include it really early from the beginning of the process, as they're just starting to write the code, and then you understand that, you can immediately see areas that you have to be alerted about or focused on. Um, Yes, and I think this is one of the key aspects of it, and it's really interesting to also understand what else we can do with Oscar. And I bet you have a few ideas, Katie.
I do. I do. I mean, I think Oscar for ADR just makes a huge amount of sense. First of all, it's a framework focused specifically on applications. It helps shine the light on where to go. It's like when I was thinking about this, actually, Oscar for application detection and response. So I don't know how old everybody else on this webinar is, but when I first started driving, we had paper maps. Do you remember those, Boaz? Paper maps.
Yes,
We did not have GPS. And it's the difference between having a paper map in your car while you're driving and having today's modern GPS. If you had the paper map, you can go, I have to get from point A to point B. I'm really unfamiliar with point B, but all right, here seem to be the streets. Are there any construction issues? Are there any one-way streets? What kind of neighborhood am I going through? Are there any landmarks in that neighborhood? And you really had to plan. I don't know. I got lost a lot when I had to use a paper map. But GPS tells you go left. Like it kind of shouts at you, go left. Avoid this problem on your right. That's what
exactly.
Oscar does for ADR. It gives you a detection and response capability that's a lot more clear, and getting everybody on the same page is super, super important because right now we don't have a common language. Right now we have a development language and we have a security language. And sometimes they meet in the middle and then there are fireworks. We don't want that. We want common language, common understanding, and we need collaboration between developers and security, right?
Exactly. I love the analogy, by the way. I always got into one-way streets. I couldn't turn left in Tel Aviv. I was constantly going with the map. I couldn't turn left, so I had to keep driving around and around in circles.
I saw somebody the other day who was coming one way down my one-way street the opposite way. And I was like, oh my God, come on, stop this, stop this. And I waved at him and he quickly turned around and I'm like, Somebody either ignored his GPS or he just didn't care. But yeah, it is. It's the difference. Oscar for ADR is the difference between that GPS and that digital map that eventually got rained on or crumpled in your passenger seat or your kid stepped on or,
Yeah,
it just wasn't sustainable.
exactly. Also, you have to stop. Well, if you're a safe driver, you stop,
It-
you look at the map, you're trying to figure out where you're going. With, the digital one, you don't have to stop. You can just keep going.
yeah,
I love that.
yeah. I don't know about traffic in Israel and in Tel Aviv in
Oh,
particular, but I can tell you in Boston it's terrible.
it's also terrible. It's a city, of course. It's really terrible, but um, I think that from a understanding perspective, and for me, what I took from the analogy is that you don't have to stop. I always stopped and looked at the map, especially when it's there's a lot of turns and I'm trying to understand where to go. I don't have to stop. I just drive. I don't even look at the map anymore. Just the maps tells me you go left, I go left. They tell me go right, I go right. Eventually, I'll get there.
Well, then you're a good driver, Boaz, but we have a lot of bad drivers, and we're continuing along this analogy. A lot of bad drivers who don't stop to look at their map. They look at their map while they're driving and they cause crashes. In our development analogy, there's a crash there, and it's usually an attacker getting into the software supply chain.
Yeah.
So let's move on. Some next steps. I'll kick it off and then I'll throw it to you for some color. How's that?
Fantastic. Let's do it.
So, as we mentioned at the beginning, Oscar, free and open resource framework. We want you to use it. We want you to be part of the community. So, on the next slide, you'll see it, but it's pbom.dev. Go there. Check out the resource because Oscar, the open software supply chain attack reference, is yours, just as it is ours, just as it is the other collaborators. But what do you do? Aside from downloading it, don't just download it, use it because it's going to help you as an organization to build your strategy and defenses. It is an organized, structured way to look at your organization, how it's developing software, how it's deploying software. It's going to uncover the most important risks and show you how to prioritize them by the prevalence that we know is in the attacker life cycle. With Oscar, you can look at how you're going to approach these problems. So you're going to end up with an improved software supply chain security program because it's focused on the entirety of the AppSec, the app dev lifecycle, and it gives our AppSec, our development, and our product security teams a common understanding of the issues. And it will give you a good way to detect threats early, because the earlier in the kill chain that you find them, you're going to have faster, better remediation. You're going to have a reduced attack surface because software, especially vulnerable software, of course, increases the attack surface. And it gives teams a systematic way to look at all stages and the most concerning areas and put your defenses there. Give companies a way to hone in on the problems that have been prioritized, and looking at how attackers think and act, security and development teams can practice their defenses and develop prioritization for the highest severity issues. Because we don't want these issues to become incidents, and we don't want these incidents to become declared breaches, and we don't want these breaches to cause further operational disruption, right? Uh,
Yes.
Compliance issues, legal fines, all that kind of stuff. It's bad news when it gets there, right? We don't want our organizations to be faced with these major incidents, right? And Oscar brings into the fold community collaboration and continuous improvement. And that's why we want people to get involved. And so this is what we recommend you do. But there's one thing that Oscar's really good at. And we know that it revolves around threats, right, Boaz? So
Yes.
what's the threat-related thing that Oscar serves as the foundation for?
So it's really the foundation, and I'm glad that you brought it up, foundation for a very successful threat modeling. So as you're kind of thinking about, you're thinking about your security program, you're thinking about your applications, you're thinking about your organization, how the business operates, and eventually you want to start understanding the scope of what you're doing, where you want to put your focus. And eventually, through that, you also want to understand where you're vulnerable. And if to use another analogy, Oscar really helps you predict where the ball is going to land. And so you can put yourself in that spot and I would say prevent the ball from ever getting into your own goal, depending on which game you're playing. But the idea really is that it allows you to model your organization based on threats that are affecting your own specific applications. And that allows you to really start creating effective program, not just saying effective, but really effective program that hones in on actual risks that you can plan before the code is even developed. And you can also understand that when you start developing something and you put, Oscar as kind of the mirror, it also helps you set the right amount of time for developers because you know that there are going to be security issues, you know that they're going to fix them. So I can start building that into everything, into every cycle that I'm doing. And eventually, what we see companies that are using Oscar today, they see that security is actually complementing to the development and allowing them to get faster into the market, allowing them to, instead of stopping them just before the release, they're getting them the right information at the right time and bringing that into a faster time to market. I had a conversation with our customer today, and that saves them days of every release. So they're releasing once a week, and previously they were stuck with kind of every release, and now they're releasing on time. Everything is manageable. They're getting more feature into every release. So I think this is really coming from the customer side of things. This is where Oscar can really help in that sense.
Absolutely. And that threat model is super, super important, right? Because it's going to be individual to each organization.
Exactly.
So to wrap up, we can take some questions if we have them. But to wrap up, join the Oscar community. Here's the website, pbomb.dev, if you want to go there. If you want to look at Oscar and see how you can apply it to your own organization to improve software supply chain security, detect threats earlier, help reduce your attack surface for software and applications, and get a faster mean time to response, all underpinned, of course, that threat modeling individuality. This is not a tool to plug and play. It is a tool to use and keep you involved in this process and really work with development teams, work with fellow security teams, and make sure this is a living, breathing thing. So please join us at pbomb.dev. Do we have any questions?
Well, let's take a look. No, I think it's really clear. Um, we did a good job. I think we did a good job here.
We did
Yeah.
a great job.
Yeah, fantastic. Everything is understandable. But, as I just want to reinforce what you just said around joining the community. As Oscar will get more collaborations and we're seeing a lot of people contributing to it, it will allow more and more organization to have a better understanding of software supply chain and really meet those types of issues head on. And I feel that this is something that um, will benefit the entire community, the entire market for that. And thank you very much for sending your thanks through the chat.
Thank you, everybody. We're going to wrap up for today. If you have further questions, please let us know. Boaz, thanks for joining me for a fun
Thank you,
conversation.
Katie. It was
Thank
amazing.
you for everybody on the line, and we'll see you on the next one.
Thank you. Have a great one.